Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the second of a series of 3 webinars that the Canola Council of Canada is working with AMTS to bring information to you on research and practical application of the use of canola meal in dairy diets. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Antonio Faciola from the University of Florida with us, and he will be highlighting his research on canola meal as a main protein source in dairy diets. So I just want to, before we start here, give a brief introduction of myself and then introduce Dr. Faciola. So my name is Brittany Dick, and I work with the Canola Council of Canada. My role is to really bring the research that the council has been involved in and bring it to industry. So that's that primary piece of taking the research and making it useful for the dairy industry. Research is a very pivotal, important piece of the Canola Council, and we have invested significant dollars in research institutions across North America to really specifically hone in on the question around canola meal and the importance of it in dairy diets. And the results of that research have really brought to light just how beneficial canola meal can be in dairy diets. I want to, as well, before I introduce Dr. Faciola, just say thank you to AMTS, thank you to Marion and her team for partnering with us on this effort. We really, really appreciate it. And I just want to say to all of those on the call today, thank you for taking the time to come and hear about topics of dairy cattle nutrition during a time when the dairy industry in the United States and other places is really, really going through hard times. So I just want to acknowledge that. And so now I'll introduce Dr. Faciola to you, and then we'll take it away. So Dr. Antonio Faciola is an assistant professor at the University of Florida. The overarching goal of his program is to improve the efficiency of nutrient utilization in dairy cows to enhance production and minimize its environmental impact. Since 2013, Dr. Faciola has published 42 papers, presented 23 invited talks in over 9 different countries, has secured $5 million in competitive grants, mentored 13 grad students, 24 visiting scholars, 3 postdocs, and over 55 undergrads in his lab. Dr. Faciola has demonstrated that canola meal improves milk production when replacing soybean meal in diets of dairy cows, which has contributed to the wide adoption of canola meal throughout the United States and beyond. He is an associate editor for Frontiers in Microbiology and Scientia Agricola, and an editorial board member for the Journal of Dairy Science. He has been recognized with several awards, including the 2018 Lallement Forward Award for Scientific Excellence in Dairy Nutrition, given by the American Dairy Science Association. And the Canola Council has had just great times working with Dr. Faciola, and we're really excited to be with him again today. So Dr. Faciola, I'll let you take it away, and we look forward to answering your questions at the end of the talk today.
All right, thank you, Brittany, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Essie, and everybody else under Canola. I also would like to thank AMTS for the invitation and for putting together this seminar. Is my audio okay for you? Yes, okay. Good. So it's really my pleasure to talk about the work that I've been doing with canola meal. I've been working with canola meal for several years now, and the goal of this presentation is really to summarize some of the findings that we did in vitro work, in vivo work, and also screening different types of canola meal from multiple years. So that's going to be the goal of today's seminar. So really a highlight of the canola meal research that my group was able to do over the years. All right, so a brief outline of my presentation. My former colleague, the late Dr. Charles Staples, always ask me when I was doing presentations here to have a clicker question to engage the audience. So we'll start with that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why canola meal. I have a pretty good guess that the audience is really familiar with canola meal, but we'll touch base on why we use canola meal and then share the results from several studies and focus on all studies published in Journal Dairy Science, the premier journal in dairy science in the world. And also, I'm going to touch briefly on a few other studies that evaluated canola meal with other protein sources for dairy cows, and then we'll conclude. All right. So for my clicker question, I want to know if you know, when we replace soybean meal, the most commonly used protein supplement, at least here in the US, with canola meal, what kind of response do we get in general in terms of performance and nitrogen utilization? So option A would be a greater supply of microbial protein. Option B would be a better essential amino acid supply to the metabolizable protein. C would be improvements in ruminal fermentation. D would be increasing dry matter intake. And then E would be B and D, which is better essential amino acid supply and dry matter intake. So let's pause for a moment and think about when we replace soybean with canola, what kind of response do you typically notice? All right. We'll go back to this question at the end of the presentation. Hopefully, everybody's going to get 100% in your answers. All right. So why canola meal? The goal of this slide here, you have, I'm going to use my mouse as a pointer. Hopefully, you can see the error here. Going from the early 90s to this graph only shows 2014. But really the point I want to make is that if you look at the 90s, the production of canola in Canada has more than double from early 90s to, the 2000s. So that, that created a great supply. And this demand is coming from oil, and of course we have canola meal as a byproduct of oil, of canola oil, and it's and the production has been increasing over the years, which means that we have this abundance of canola meal, which can be used as an excellent source of protein for dairy cows, and that's what we're going to focus. So again, a really sharp increase in production led us to have this protein for feeding cows. All right, so canola meal, early studies have shown that canola meal was equal as good and sometimes even better than other protein sources. Typically, and I'm going to present here a study from my postdoc in 2000 that was published in 2015. Large trial. We're going to get into details of this trial in a few slides. But overall, increasing dry matter intake, increasing milk production, increasing true protein production, reduction on milk urea nitrogen and UN, and also reduction in urinary nitrogen excretion. Very common results observed in actually multiple trials. Overall increase in nitrogen efficiency. So this was not only from this trial, but this is fairly commonly in multiple trials around early 2000s. So the problem was that if you look at the NRC 2001, which may be eventually replaced. I know that the committee has been working hard on getting the new revised edition. The NRC 2001 really doesn't show canola meal as good as, for example, soybean when you use that as a model. And as I just mentioned in the previous slide, there were several studies showing that canola meal can be as good as different proteins. In the case of my research, we focus on soybean, but there has other research doing working on the cereals grains, cottonseed meal, and etc. So we were really puzzled why that was not the case for the tables in the 2001 NRC. All right, so as I mentioned before, the goal of the presentation is really to summarize the studies we've been working over the years with in vitro studies, chemical studies looking at canola meal composition and variation among different canola meals. Also in vivo trials looking at both nitrogen metabolism, nitrogen flows, and also milk production and milk composition. So the first study I want to summarize is this study published in 2015, which was part of my postdoc research when I was at the USDA Dairy Forage Center in Madison, Wisconsin. This was a large trial, 50 cows. We had actually different levels of protein, and we had either soybean and canola as the main protein source. So I'm going to summarize here only bean and canola combining, and see we observed about half a kilogram increase in dry matter intake when we fed canola meal, and about a 1 kilogram difference in a greater milk production when we fed canola meal compared to soybean meal. This has been very consistent, especially when we look at milk production. This increase in a kilogram of milk per day has been very consistent across other trials as well. So I think that kind of, that was one of the first papers from the work that I did that really ignited more research and frankly the utilization of canola meal. I travel quite a bit, not so much right now, but we visit several farms here in Florida. Most farms feed canola meal, and this has been the case in many places where I've been. That trial also found a tendency to increase fat, fat production, which is something that we haven't observed in other studies. One thing that we have also consistently observed when we replaced soybean with canola was the increase in true protein production and also the decrease in milk urea nitrogen. That has been very consistent, a decrease in milk urea nitrogen, which is an indication of a better nitrogen utilization. We have less urea in the milk. So overall, this large feeding trial showed increasing production when we replaced soybean with canola meal. All right, in the same trial, I also want to show that when we look at ruminant fermentation, canola meal reduced ammonia nitrogen, which is consistent with the milk urea nitrogen that we observed. And also, another thing that has been very consistent across experiments has been a decrease in brain chain VFAs, which are VFAs that are coming from degradation of brain chain amino acids. And again, that's both the ammonia nitrogen reduction and also the reduction in brain chain VFAs are indication of lower degradation of those proteins in canola meal diets. Again, very consistent across trials. All right, so after this large trial, one thing that we did and another project that we did and was published in 2016 was a survey. We surveyed all crushing plants that produce canola meal in Canada, at the time 12 plants, over 4 different years. And we want to look at the differences in chemical composition of canola meal. We know that there is a variation in soybean meal. We were not sure at the time what kind of variation we would find in canola meal. And that's important for two things. First, we wanted to see if, if those differences, if they make a difference in terms of nitrogen utilization, in terms of production of cows. And that can have two important issues related to that. Either, there may be difference that can be translated in nitrogen utilization or milk production, or, despite the differences, if you are in New York and if you're getting canola meal from, one part of Canada, or if you're in California and you're getting canola meal from a completely different crushing plant, does that make a difference? So we wanted to know that. So I'm showing here just a summary from two different plants. I picked the ones that were very different. And you can see here in the orange, Go Gators, that RUP was about 10 units, so 15, more or less 15% difference in RUP in terms of the lowest RUP and the highest RUP that we observed in canola meals. If you look at the publication, you see all kinds of chemical analysis that we did in multiple canola meals. But then the question came, does that make a difference? If we use a canola meal that is high in RUP, does that going to make a difference in nitrogen utilization and milk production? So we actually did a few trials to look at that. First, we did in vitro trial, and we collect samples from that survey that were very contrasting in terms of RUP, and we tested in vitro using our dual flow continuous culture system to see if that would change ruminal fermentation. Then we did a follow-up trial that was also published in Journal of Dairy Science with feeding canola meals that were different canola meals, and in that case we used a commercial product that was based on canola meal. It was a heat-treated product to see if these variations in canola would make a difference in terms of production. So let me show you the results and from our in vitro study first. So the dual flow continuous culture is a system that was developed in the 70s by Hoover in West Virginia. We were lucky maybe to, or just had the vision to really bring back and get a lot of work done on this system, which we think it's a very powerful system to compare different diets, different treatments. So the beauty of this system is that it really isolates the rumen. So we have same flow out of the fermenter, same intake. We are really focusing what's happening in the rumen when we use this fermenter system. So for this study, a 3x3 Latin square, each period is 10 days, 7 days for adaptation, 3 days for collection. The fermenters, they are kept at around 39 degrees Celsius, and we use nitrogen gas to keep the environment anaerobic, and we control rate of passage to simulate a high-producing cow. So for this trial, here are the diets. The goal was really to include in the diet as much canola meal as possible. So here you have soybean meal at 25% of the diet. Low canola meal means low RUP canola meal, and then we have high canola meal. As you can see, the levels of canola meal were pretty high, over 30% of the diet. And that was the intention, was to see how much we could include, because again, those RUP difference between the low canola and the high canola, despite looking, maybe a 15% difference in RUP for those canolas, it's really difficult to get a substantial difference in RUP in the diets when you are using low or not not a lot of canola. So the previous studies, usually canola is 10, 12% inclusion in the diet. So here, as a consequence of that, we had pretty high crude protein levels, levels that we would not typically feed. But again, the goal was really to see if there was a difference in canola degradation in the rumen or in microbial protein growth in the rumen. Same energy, more or less same energy for the diets. So what we observed was that, again, the brain chain fatty acids were different, as consistent with other studies. Lower brain chain VFA, indicating a lower degradation of those canola. But when we look at VFAs and proportional VFAs, we didn't really find any difference between canolas, the different canolas. When we look at nitrogen flows, here this contrast compares soybean with the two canolas, and the other contrast compare the two canolas. Really not a lot of difference in terms of nitrogen utilization. So despite the differences, oops, let's go back one. So despite the difference in RUP that we observed on this 4-year survey of all crushing plants in Canada, that did not translate into any differences in terms of nitrogen utilization in the rumen when we use our in vitro system. So, of course, the natural evolution of that would be to test that in a in vivo situation. So we did a couple studies, also published in Journal Dairy Science, feeding those two types of canola. For the in vivo study, we had this commercial product based on canola, and we did one part of the study looking at omasal flows with rumen canulated animals, and we also had another part of the study with 45 lactating cows looking at milk production and composition. So for the omasal study, we had 6 cows, 6 rumen canulated cows, and Latin square design. We had 3 treatments. Here, typical diets from Midwest type of diets, alfalfa silage and corn silage, about close to 60% of the diet. And then we had the inclusions of canola meal at about 11% of the diet. And the crude protein level, about 15.5% crude protein. And same, more or less same energy. When we look at omasal flows, we did observe a tendency for the canola diets, both the canola and the treated canola, to get a little higher nitrogen intake. But that was pretty much it in terms of nitrogen utilization. We didn't find much difference in terms of IUP, for example. No difference in terms of RUP. So again, maybe in typical diets, that variation that we observed across multiple years and multiple crushing plants really didn't make a difference in terms of nitrogen utilization in the rumen, which really tells us that no matter where you're getting canola, you should get the same results in terms of nitrogen utilization. Then we did another phase of this project was to look at production. So 45 cows, we had the same 3 diets, and here when we compare soybean with both canolas, really no difference, no statistical difference, and when we compared both canolas, we had no difference. Okay, statistical difference. Again, this was a 45 cow study, and for this trial, instead of using a Latin square design, we used a complete randomized design. So those 15 cows, each 15 cows per treatment, and they stay on the diet. We didn't switch them, which means that we didn't have as much statistical power. If you see the milk production, the canola meal had a numerical difference, and I know some statisticians will get upset, but the numerical difference here was over a kilogram, which is very consistent with the difference that we observed in previous studies that were a significant difference in terms of statistical difference. In this study, we're not. So we're not discussing really the difference, but I want to point out that we did observe greater, a numerical difference for canola, okay? And a half kilogram for the regular canola. Even in terms of intake, the canola was almost half a kilogram greater. It's likely that we were underpowered for this study. When we look at nitrogen metabolism, again, milk urea nitrogen was reduced when we compared canolas with the soybean diet. Again, very consistent. And we also found a reduction in urinary nitrogen, urinary urea nitrogen when we fed canola. So less of the nitrogen in the form of urea, which is a good thing, indicates that cows are using nitrogen more efficiently. Okay. We also observed in terms of nitrogen utilization reduction in the percentage of the nitrogen intake. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you something really interesting from this trial is that we observe the canola diets increase digestibility for dry matter, for organic matter, and for protein and also fiber. So this was something that we did not observe in other studies, but really interesting to see canola meal diets with greater digestibility, statistical difference when comparing to the soybean. All right. All right, so I showed you that when we replace soybean with canola, we increase about a kilogram of milk per day. We reduce branched chain fatty acids in the rumen, indicating better nitrogen utilization. We reduce milk urea nitrogen, which also indicates a better nitrogen utilization by the animal. And we also look at this variation in canola meal and show that despite the variation, there's no difference in terms of nitrogen utilization among canolas and also in terms of milk production. So the next question would be, if we feed canola meal with different forages, does that make a difference? So that was the latest study that was published early this year in 2020 in Journal Dairy Science. Also, before I forget, I want to give a lot of credit to my former PhD student, Eduardo De Paula, who did all of those studies that I'm presenting here, and he's now a research scientist back in Brazil. So thank you, Eduardo, for your great work if you are listening. So the next stage was really to test if canola would be different depending on the forage that we fed. So the goal of this project was to have diets with different forages and feeding canola and soybean and see if canola would again be superior than soybean in terms of milk production. We had 48 cows in this trial, and we had 6 diets. And in a nutshell, we had diets, they all had about 60% forage, and the forage vary from alfalfa to corn silage. So we had diet 5-to-1 alfalfa to corn silage, and that was the soybean and also canola meal diet. And then we had the diets that were 50-50, so 30% more or less of alfalfa silage and corn silage, each of them. And then we had diets that were 1-to-5, so 10% alfalfa silage, 50% corn silage, and that again for soybean and canola meal. So going from high alfalfa silage diet to a high corn silage diet, changing alfalfa to corn silage ratio, and changing the protein from soybean to canola. The inclusion levels vary from about 5 all the way to almost 20, 18% canola meal in the diets for the diets with more corn. And the crude protein was about 16% across all diets. Here's a summary of the production when cows were in either soybean and canola. And you can guess here the difference in milk production, again, about a kilogram difference. Very, very consistent across multiple experiments over the years. This 1 kilogram difference in milk yield when we fed canola meal. Protein production, again, we observed increase in protein production, milk protein production. And this particular study, we observed a trend to increase lactose as well. And again, when we look at milk urea nitrogen, very, very consistent, a decrease in milk urea nitrogen when we replace soybean with canola meal. When we look at here, you have the alfalfa silage to corn silage ratio and the milk yield. So if you notice here, when we had diets with more alfalfa silage, 50%, and lower corn silage, the difference between soybean and canola was greater. In fact, was significant different when we fed diets that are high in alfalfa silage. That difference, we did not observe that difference when diets were higher in corn silage. So it's likely that if you have a very high corn silage diet, in this case, most of the metabolizable protein were coming from microbial protein, from the rumen, from these cows that are being fed high corn silage diet as compared to alfalfa silage, which has a more degradable protein fraction. So if you are feeding alfalfa silage, the benefits of feeding canola meal are likely to be greater than if you're feeding a high corn silage diet. Now, regardless of forages, in this case alfalfa and corn silage, when we look at milk urea nitrogen, canola meal really improve milk urea nitrogen. So canola meal reduce milk urea nitrogen when replacing soybean meal, regardless of the forage that was. Okay. Now, let me go back just a second. So this has been published in Journal Dairy Science, so you can see the details and of experiment design and the other differences that were observed. This is really a summary of those. I want to point out that there are other studies. So Dr. Breeder and Broder, they did, in 2017, they published a study looking at canola meal, soybean meal, and cottonseed meal. They also observed, again, about 1 kilogram difference in canola meal when replaced soybean meal. There's been studies in looking at replacing canola meal and distillers grains. Some of them do not find difference. Some of them even found the difference, negative difference, so canola meal not being as good as distillers grains. And because there's a lot of variation in distillers grains, I'm not going to focus on specific of this study. I also want to point out there has been a couple meta-analyses on canola, and it's been very consistent, that increase when we replace soybean with canola meal. So some of the conclusions for all those studies. When we replace soybean with canola, we observe that typically increasing dry matter intake, milk yield, milk protein production, and we reduce ruminal ammonia and milk urea nitrogen. Those have been very consistent. Now, less consistent, canola meal may also replace other proteins that are commonly used, but less consistent than when we replace soybean. Response in canola meal, they will vary depending on the forages that you use. And if you use alfalfa, chances are that canola meal will give you a better benefit than if you're feeding, for example, corn silage. The variations in canola meal that we observed over 4 years in multiple crushing plants, they were significant in terms of chemical difference, but they were not translated into nitrogen utilization or milk production. Based on in vitro and in vivo studies, when we replaced soybean in canola, really we didn't change ruminal fermentation. And because of that, we are pretty confident that canola meal is having a post-ruminal effect when replaces soybean meal. Lastly, there has been some studies trying to do like heat protection of canola meal, and so far as I know, I haven't seen any really commercial product that has been consistent in being a better source than just regular canola, for example. Now, if we go back to the original question, I hope most of you are going to be able to answer correctly what happens when we replace soybean with canola meal. Greater supply of microbial protein, better essential amino acids in the metabolizable protein, improvements in ruminal fermentation, increasing dry matter intake, and you may guess that it's going to be E. We've not seen any difference in microbial or ruminal fermentation. It really, we have some indications that canola has a post-ruminal effect that really is the reason for that milk production and also increasing dry matter intake. All right. With that, I would like to thank the Canola Council, my former advisor, Broderick Nutrition, the Dairy Forage Center, the University of Florida, and especially I want to really thank the group of grad students that really are the ones doing the hard work. So with that, I thank everyone that took the time to listen to me talking today. If you have any further questions after we are done, please feel free to send me an email. You can also visit my website and find me on social media. I'll be happy to entertain any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Faciola. I'm going to take back control of the screen so that I can move through the presentation as you need to, okay?
All right.
All right, I need to just get to the right place, and then Brittany will introduce our next webinars and finish out, so. Okay, Brittany, it's all yours. Just tell me when to progress.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So thanks everyone, and thanks Antonio. And we're going to have some time for questions here. We just wanted to highlight here a couple of things for you before we get to those questions. So first off is the AMTS's the Nutritionist webinar series, and I believe, Marian, you can correct me if that's wrong, but I believe that runs monthly.
Yes.
And so please check out the website to see what's upcoming and how to register.
Yes, and I'll just to butt in a little bit, Brittany. Yes, our next webinar will feature Dr. Bill Stone from Diamond V, and he's going to talk about some practical aspects of just being a nutritionist, things like taking proper forage samples and what he does to analyze herds. We run that webinar every second Thursday of the month. We do it at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time or Eastern Standard Time, depending on the month, and 6 p.m. And it is in the same format as this webinar. It's a recorded webinar with live questions following. So just email webinars@agmodelsystems to join that webinar list.
Great. Okay, we just wanted to highlight a couple of other resources for you. We have the 2019 canola meal dairy feed guide that is available. So if you go to canolamazing.com, you'll be able to find that feed guide. Much of the research that Dr. Faciola just presented is available in that feed guide, as well as many more. And we update that guide usually every 4 to 5 years. So this is our most recent version. And Marianne, if you'd like to pass to the last slide here, we will let you know about our final webinar in this series focusing on canola meal. So Dr. Ken Kalsher with the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center is going to present on June 2nd, and we can confirm that date now. So on June 2nd, Dr. Kalsher will present examining the role of canola meal in the diets of early lactation cows. So please do put that in your calendar, and you'll see some promotion coming out from us on that. We look forward to that. So I believe, Marianne, that is it for slides.
One more.
Oh, one more here. Sorry about that.
Just as a reminder, the nutritionist and some links for you to contact. Dr. Faciola, as we progress through the questions, will you just tell me what slide to go to if you need to use one of your slides as an explanation tool? And in the meantime, please write your questions in the question and answer window or the chat window. I'm monitoring both, and I will answer those questions. You can address questions to both Dr. Faciola, Brittany. Dr. Essie Evans is with us in the panelist room as well. So if you have a question that you would like to address to her as you're listening, that you know that she might be particularly adept at, please do so. So also, I won't identify you as I ask the question for you, but if you wish to be identified, just say this is so and so. Otherwise, I know who you are, but everybody else doesn't. So beginning with the first question. Let's see, for more than 30 years, rapeseed meal, canola meal, has been used in dairy cow rations in mainland France. It replaces other cakes as soon as its price is attractive. Based on an amino acid formulation, the current ration is 65% compared to a soybean meal of 48%. How is it that you do not mention this in composition in methionine, which seems to be its specific advantage? Dr. Faciola, you're not unmuted, so go ahead. And I can unmute you if you'd like. There, you're good.
All right. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I focus on what we've done here in the lab, but that's true. So I've been, for example, to Europe a couple years ago, and also to South Africa, and the same with in rapeseed. And it's true that it has less protein, but a good amino acid profile. And I think there's going to be more questions about the amino acid profile. We have not done any specific amino acid profile for the meals, but Dr. Len Lapierre has a wealth of data on amino acid flow and amino acid utilization. I would refer to the work done by her group in Canada. There's specifically 2 meta-analyses, fairly recent, showing the benefits in terms of amino acid supply when canola meal is fed. But because we have not done amino acid profile, I prefer not to. I do not have any data from my research to show.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, any reason why RUP at plants varied? Is it because of heat treatment, processing differences, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. For sure, we noticed that there were a couple plants that they had different different processing schedule, and I think the heat treatment did play a role in those two plants. The other difference, again, it could be, and I know that I know maybe Brittany knows that, but there's different varieties of canola, and that could explain a little bit of the proteins difference. There was a group looking at the specific types of proteins in canola meal, and the degradation of those proteins. So I think part of the difference comes from a little bit of difference in varieties, and part of the difference is definitely coming from how those canolas processed, the extraction method. There's a couple different extraction methods for the oil, and I think that affects the canola. But again, that 10 units in RUP that we were able to detect, they were chemically different, but in terms of rumen fermentation, they really didn't make a big difference. There was not able to detect, and I think a big part of that is that we don't feed enough canola in a diet to really create that, those RUP difference in terms of the diet as a whole.
Would that be a good argument for ensuring that you have some analyses done on each meal as you take a load?
Yes. So I think that would be something good to do to check the composition. But again, I think that also gives a little peace of mind that those chemical differences, they really don't make a big difference. And again, if you are in New York, you're getting a certain type of canola meal, or if you're in Florida, or if you're in California, based on this research and looking at all this, multiple years, there's not a lot of evidence that, canolas coming from different parts of Canada or from different plants really are going to be different in terms of production or nutrient utilization.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer to that question. I think you're spot on. Some very, minor differences across plants could occur. Some differences in location, source of seed, perhaps. The canola crop is fairly uniform, but of course, there could be some differences. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, these plants are all solvent extracted based. So maybe some minor differences there, and then between environment is probably the answer to that question. But I think, Dr. Faciola, you highlighted it really well, that yes, testing upon receiving product is, I think, always a good practice in industry. And how does the cow respond is really the critical piece.
Okay, thank you, Brittany. How is canola meal amino acid profile compared to other RUP sources, especially compared to soy? Mm-hmm. And if you have a slide you want me to move to, just say so.
Yeah, I wish I had a slide on that, because that's a very common question. Again, I think the world expert on the RUP and the amino acid supply is Dr. Elena Lapierre, and she's done quite a bit of work on canola, and it does seem to have a better amino acid profile, and that's, I think, part of the explanation of why it improves milk production. I have not done that, so that's why I don't have a slide on the amino acid composition.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, the next one is, first of all, thank you for the great presentation. And please, is there any economic difference in terms of feeding soybean meal or canola meal in dairy cows? And
Yeah,
this is from Australia. Sorry, if that helps you frame your question.
yes, yes. It's good to know. I saw what's coming from Australia. So that's going to depend a lot on location. For example, we feed canola here in Florida, despite being fairly far away from Canada. It depends a lot on the cost of transportation. Usually, we can get canola a little cheaper than soybean, and that becomes economical. It kind of needs to be that way since pound per pound you get more protein out of soybean. But it has been economically given the increase in milk production and the consistent in terms of intake. I don't have any data on that, but I go to farms and here we have some big dairy farms in North Florida, and one comment that I get is that it seems that there's less variation in intake when they switch to canola. So that's something that I have never tried to measure. But I think the economics will largely depend on where you are and the cost. The cost of getting canola versus other protein sources.
And that's same question similarly in Brazil. Do you have any specifics to address in that country?
Yeah. So I'm originally from Brazil, but I haven't had the chance to work with canola in Brazil. I know in southern Brazil, it would probably be economical. It depends a lot to where you're getting and the transportation and the cost of that. Brazil produces a lot of soybean, and in the central part of Brazil, it's a major area for soybean production. So it's going to depend a lot on where you're able to grow. Here in North America, we can get canola coming from Canada or maybe coming from Dakotas, coming from other places here in the U.S. And it's very competitive. But I'm not sure in Brazil if that would be the case if we factor in the transportation in areas where you can grow canola well, more towards the south of Brazil.
Okay. Thank you. Going back to France, one of the main drawbacks for canola in Europe and in France is its GMO nature. Do you think that it is a strong disadvantage for its export to European countries?
I'm not an expert on that. I think when I was in Europe or in South Africa, I think the biggest question or the biggest concern with rapeseed, not really canola, was the variation in the nutritional composition in terms of erucic acid and other things that make canola less digestible and maybe palatability issues, because you can get excellent rapeseed, but you can also get really bad rapeseed. So there was kind of a big variation in terms of rapeseed. We don't see that with canola because, as you mentioned, has been bred out and it's a more consistent, better product in terms of protein composition. So that could play a role. I don't know if Brittany has any numbers in terms of exports to Europe.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's a good point. Obviously, that is a challenge. The crop in Canada is largely GMO, and there are some restrictions for export to around the world, depending on different countries. The canola industry really, we really make sure that the crop we grow is able to be exported to our main countries that are consistently purchasing canola. That is a very, very important element in Canada. But Europe does have, like Dr. Faciola has said, has a rapeseed crop. And while we do export canola seed to Europe for biodiesel production, there is a rapeseed crop in Europe, and so demand for the product may not be quite as it would be in other countries like the US, where canola rapeseed is not grown to the same extent.
Okay, and I apologize, earlier in reading a question, I was erroneously thinking rapeseed and canola were interchangeable, and they're not necessarily. So thank you, I learned. I always learn something, but I learned even more. So next question, and this is sort of a follow-up, just to follow up on those questions about the cost effectiveness of replacing soybean meal. In Australia, yes, you're right, it depends on availability, cost of production, and accessibility. So moving to another question, this one is from Sami Esadawe in China. He says, we're feeding canola meal in dairy Holstein cows in a 50-50 forage to concentrate ratio. We showed improving in dry matter intake and energy corrected milk production, and a decrease in milk urea nitrogen, as well as animal performance, including other reproduction parameters. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Thanks for sharing, Sammy. I'm glad to hear that. As I mentioned, I think I emphasized a lot. I mean, it has been consistent. So it's good to know that you're feeding more or less diets that we would feed, maybe a little more concentrate, but you're still getting the consistent increase in milk and in dry matter intake. So that exactly has been what we observed. So I'm going to be presenting a seminar, a Chinese version. So stay tuned for that in the next few weeks. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Let's see, how much residual canola oil is in the canola meal, and does this contribute to increased milk production?
Yeah, good question. So not really, because we control the diets for energy levels, so not a lot. Again, that's going to vary depending on the extraction method, but typically solvent extractions are going to leave very little residual oil. If you have like a cold press type of oil, to remove the oil, you may get a little more, but the difference are not going to make a big, it's not the oil that it's really causing that. It's really the protein side of it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry, I get distracted looking through to make sure that I have caught things. Can you use only canola meal alone as a lone source of protein in a ration? And if yes, how much is the maximum quantity can you put of canola meal in the ration?
Okay, good question. So we have not done a study, looking at how far we can go in terms of canola utilization. I showed you some of the work we really wanted to see how we didn't want to see how much we could use. We just needed to have a lot of canola to create those RUP difference. So we went up to 25% canola in the diet, or a little over 30%, which is pretty high. Typical diets will have around 12, 14, percent. But I don't see really any negative, unless you have some, rapeseed with erucic acid, or I don't see anything negative. It's going to depend a lot on your forage source. If you have something like alfalfa, you're not going to be able to go very high, because alfalfa, it's pretty high in protein, in nitrogen. So it depends on your forage, but I don't see any negative on having, for example, canola meal as the only major source, not counting the forage protein. So I don't see any issues with that. But again, we haven't done any study to really show that.
Okay, thank you. And this is a comment as well as sort of a question, and your thoughts on this, and maybe this is something Brittany can also address. And I wondered this. Interestingly, canola is primarily raised in Canada, but less so in the United States. Is it related to the growing conditions, history? Why is that?
Mhm. Okay, great question. Yeah, so canola was actually developed in Canada. So that's maybe one critical piece. So canola was bred through traditional plant breeding techniques between two universities, University of Saskatchewan and the University of Manitoba, to develop canola, which reduced that erucic acid content, as well as the glucosinolate content, which is that really bitter taste. And so that did happen in Canada and really kind of resulted in significant planting areas of canola in Canada. There's also, of course, the growing season is right for canola. So you need lower overnight temperatures in order for the flowers, for the pods to then fill with oil. So if you have really significant heat that occurs throughout that flowering stage, and you don't have that overnight cooling, then that is a negative for the crop. And so that allows Canada to be an ideal place for growing canola.
Thank you. That's interesting because yes, in our Midwest where we would think we could grow it, we do not we have very excessively hot temperatures a good part of the summer. Coming back to the question of feeding only canola meal, in this is a somewhat of a comment. In Mexico, it's common to feed a mixture of soybean meal and canola meal, even though canola meal is cheap and that cheaper than soybean meal. Is there an optimal ratio of soybean meal to canola meal? Sorry, got my mouth in my way.
That's fine. I think that's an excellent question. Again, I don't see. I haven't done any study to see how far we can go in terms of canola. I don't foresee any problems based on the type of canola that we've been using, and digestibility and things like that. So it comes down a lot to price, and sometimes nutritionists, they want to be on the safe side, so they were like, okay, so how about if we mix this in half and half, just to be sure, we are not screwing up anything. So that plays a role, I think, sometimes when people prefer to use a mix of soybean and canola. I want to point out that I think Dr. S.C. Evans and others have worked on a website that shows, based on the price of canola, how much you get in terms of milk production. I don't really recall exactly the website, but I know she was on the call, so she may comment on, how to find this balance on, how much canola you could feed in terms of your potential milk response. Maybe Dr. Evans or Brittany could comment on that feature.
I'm here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. A couple things there with the mixes. I think if any of you listened to Daniel last week, he basically said, let your program be your guide. And he uses AMTS or a CNCPS based program. And there's often times when canola meal will win out over soybean meal, and not always. So it's going to depend on the price. It's going to depend on the other ingredients that you have available and the prices. But there's no reason that you need a specific ratio of soybean meal to canola meal. You can use 100% canola at times, and at other times, if the costs are high or the product's not available, then you have to perhaps look at some alternatives. But the amino acid balance is very similar to that of microbial protein, which is basically considered pretty much the best protein for milk production. It's much more similar than any other ingredient. You do have, as someone pointed out, it's a good source of methionine. And again, I think, if you just trust your program and you let the program provide you the optimization, then I think you can, not really worry about different ratios. And we do have a cost comparison tool, like Dr. Faciola explained, and it's at CanolAmazing.com. And we hope that you go there, just check it out, try it, see if it provides any advantage for you.
I could also just maybe add one quick thing, is that you could, feel really confident about the quality of the canola meal that you would have in Mexico. My understanding is that I would assume actually most of the canola meal that's available in Mexico is Canadian seed that's crushed in in Mexico. Wrong country on my mind. So I just wanted to add that bit in there, that that quality, I would be confident in quality.
Thank you both, Dr. Evans and Brittany. I have just one last question to ask, if people don't write anything in the windows. This is, what about the difference in protein digestibility between treatments? For example, solvent extracted versus expelled. Does the level of heat and the chemicals in some processes affect the digestibilities?
Yeah, good question. I don't have any data on, for example, looking at digestibility from one crushing plant to the other one, as only for that study. And we did not find difference when we did the in vitro study looking at digestibility from, the high and the low RUP canolas. So if you look at the canola meal, the digestibilities are unlikely to be different, just because that chemical difference, it's not really translating into any difference in fermentation and digestibility. We did observe a difference in digestibility when we compare canola to soybean in the last study, but that was the only time we observed. Again, we are talking about a protein supplement that you're feeding, maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe up to 18% in the diet. We don't think that's going to make a big difference in terms of total diet digestibility. And we have not looked at the digestibility from specific canolas from different crushing plants. But I think it's an excellent point. For example, when we look at commercial products, depending on heat treatment, that makes a difference in protein digestibility for sure. You can have, heat damaged proteins that are not digestible or lower digestibility. So that makes a difference if you are talking about, for example, commercial products. But if you are feeding canola meal, it's unlikely, in my opinion, that you will get difference in digestibility just from the raw canola meals.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Faciola. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Dr. Evans. I maybe have another question. Let's see. Oh, and thank you from our attendees. Brittany just sent a message to everyone in the chat that gave you the CanolAmazing.com webinar where you can find the dairy feed calculator. And I navigated to a slide that sort of has that URL. If you just go to CanolAmazing.com, you'll find that. As a reminder, the webinar and all of the questions, as well as the previous webinar with Daniel Scawthorne, are available on the AMTS website. And also, I'm assuming that CanolAmazing will have put up a link. But if you go to webinars at agmodelsystems.com, or no, that's an email address. So sorry. If you go to agmodelsystems.com/webinar, you will find the CanolAmazing webinar list, and you can navigate to the recorded webinar as well as sign up for the coming webinar in June. So thank you everyone for attending. We will have this recording up within the week, and also you will receive an email with the link so that you can easily navigate to it, and do share it with anyone you think that the information might be of interest for. So with that, unless we get any more questions really quickly, I will close out the webinar, and thank you all for attending. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you all.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Have a good day.